We live in an interconnected global economy. I can prove this to you with a simple thought experiment. Look around the room where you are and pick any object. Your chair, your shirt, your coffee cup. I'll take the example of my iPhone. It contains components from every continent except Antarctica. Its supplier manual lists over 40 countries. This includes rare earths from the DRC in Africa, manufacture in China, copper from Chile, processors from Taiwan, and of course, design in California. I'm going to explain why the interconnected nature of our supply chains is so central to the big challenges we face in addressing the global climate crisis and what we need to do about it. The approach of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, which are our major international climate treaties, is that each nation will reduce the emissions involved in the mining and manufacturing process, and in turn, global emissions are reduced. And this is pretty much the approach of domestic net zero targets as well. So they all focus on reducing domestic territorial emissions. So, can we think of any shortcomings of this approach? I'll propose two: the problem of responsibility and the problem of fairness. The problem of responsibility is that people in wealthy countries really like stuff. We like to click on Amazon Prime. And increasingly, the stuff that we consume is produced elsewhere. When I say elsewhere, mostly I mean China. China is responsible for the biggest flows of emissions in stuff, so-called embodied emissions. And the two biggest flows globally of embodied emissions go from China to the US, followed by China to Europe. So let's take the example of the UK. The UK has reduced its domestic territorial emissions more than any other industrialized country. At the same time, according to government figures, almost half of the UK's total emissions are embodied in the stuff that we import and consume. So another way of looking at this is the UK isn't actually reducing its emissions, it's just offshoring them. So this would suggest that in the UK, we do have a responsibility to think about our consumption and how it affects global emissions. So that is the problem of responsibility. And this brings us to the problem of fairness. The problem of fairness is that we are entering a world in which it's more expensive to emit in some countries than others. So the countries in which it's expensive to emit, call them the strict regulators, include the UK and Europe. And these countries are concerned not only are we buying things that are produced elsewhere, but we're actually incentivizing manufacturing to go to these less strict countries because it's easier and cheaper to emit there. One way to address the problem of responsibility and the problem of fairness is for these strict regulators to extend their regulatory burdens and expenses beyond their borders. And this is pretty much what's starting to happen. So, for example, the EU is now extending its domestic carbon prices to imported products in some sectors. So this sounds good. But the problem is, once a country starts trying to regulate production emissions in another country, this becomes a trade issue and it becomes very controversial because the problem of fairness cuts both ways. So some developing countries like India argue this isn't actually fair, this is unfair, because these countries contributed more to the problem and therefore they should bear more responsibility in trying to address it. They shouldn't pass off their regulatory burdens onto us. And this isn't just India's opinion, it's a central principle of the Paris Agreement. Many of the core challenges in international climate cooperation are now trade fights. And what's worse, we don't have an international rule book to tell us how we deal with the problem of responsibility and the problem of fairness. The Paris Agreement prioritizes national self-determination and sovereignty. The World Trade Organization has been helpful in creating a world where we can have products with components from over 40 countries. However, it's ill-equipped to lead international climate cooperation. And in fact, some countries actually think that climate shouldn't even be on the agenda of the WTO. Where this brings us, and what I have argued in both academic and policy-facing work, is that we need a major conceptual shift in the way we think about the trade and climate relationship, away from a siloed approach and towards a more integrated approach on both the national and the international level. But what does this actually mean in practice? On the national level, countries need trade and climate strategies that support them to increase trade and investment in low-carbon goods and services and decrease trade and investment in high-carbon goods and services. This sounds straightforward, but it is far from easy or simple to accomplish. If we return to the example of the UK, the previous government didn't even include climate in their top priorities for trade at all. And the UK is far from alone in this. So again, a major strategic conceptual shift is needed. On the international level, there's no silver bullet. However, the more discussions that can happen, the better. This includes conversations between ministers on coordinating climate and trade strategy. It also includes what might be described as technocratic discussions about how to cooperate between different regulations and standards between countries. And crucially, it involves dialogue between the wealthy, strict regulators and the poorer countries about how to support them to apply these regulations and link them to the climate finance that they desperately need in order to decarbonize themselves. These discussions are starting to happen, but they need to go much further. And this is where the fact that we live in an interconnected global economy with all of these fantastically complex supply chain interdependencies actually gives me some hope. Because while it's inevitable that there will continue to be trade tensions, and some of these could even get worse, there's also a tremendous amount of mutual dependency in a lot of different ways. And the fact that there are these mutual dependencies also gives rise to a dynamic environment for global cooperation, with many opportunities to build alliances to support a low-carbon future.